what?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can turn on the recording. No?
I think it's very difficult always to know what aspects of a person's life shape them. But there's no doubt that even within his family, he grew up with a very cosmopolitan father who spoke Persian and a very, very religious Hindu mother, but who was very concerned with education. He had a very active family life, but he was also known as a bit of a terror. And being a little terror, they were constantly trying to call on Shiva to calm him down. Now, this is part of the legend about him, but there's no doubt that he's a very active child, and he has fantastic sisters who are also learning English, very educated, and one of whom he loses, named Jogendra Bala. And people don't really know this about him, but when he was away as a sannyasin, he learned of her death, and he's really quite devastated by it. I think there's no doubt that Calcutta is unimaginable to us now, as it was then, because it's a small little place until it becomes rapidly changed. There are many different quarters with people from all walks of life, many ethnicities. It's also the home of Kaligat, of the great Kali temple, of tremendous poverty. At the same time, it's the center of what we call Hindu reformism. I think that term is sort of old now, and I think there's a better way of thinking about it. But there's much reaction to the British, who are trying to think of, the Indians are trying to think of new ways of expressing their Indianness and reacting to the critiques of Indian English administrators and educators who think of them as heathens. And I think this is very much a part of Vivekananda's world. I mean, he seems to have been a member of the first Freemason lodge on Park Street. And this was very unusual for Indians to be involved in it. And so he has the full gamut of different kinds of associations and learning. And of course, he goes to the Scottish Missionary College, where he becomes seriously bilingual. The title Guru to the World was not meant to reinforce all the cliches of India as the spiritual land that educates the West against its own materialism. Rather, what I was trying to do was question this and look at it as the central paradox of his life. On the one hand, he had to fit into the straitjacket of these Orientalist categories, Western materialism, Indian spirituality in the East. But at the same time, that was the very opening that allowed him to come into India and into the West and to say, we really are important to global culture. The problem, of course, was that he couldn't talk about aspects of Indian society that troubled him in any serious way because he was afraid of Western critiques. He was constantly on the defensive. When people said that Indian mothers threw their babies to crocodiles, it was precisely that kind of thought, or that Hindus love to burn their widows on funeral pyres. These were the kinds of ideas that he was determined to set aside. But because of that, he couldn't talk about things like untouchability. He couldn't talk about things that bothered him because he was afraid that he would be accused of needing British tutelage. The views on caste are changeable and move and very interesting. If you follow them, There are moments when he says the one thing that the British do that's good is they come in and they break up caste. And they disrupt a closed and solidified society. At other times, he says the British have turned us all into the natives, and they have made us into a homogeneous world where everyone is the same, and is the same in a negative sense. At other times, he talks about caste as a kind of collectivity, and he poses the value of caste in contrast to Western individualism. At the same time, he believes in the Kshatriya force, so he is promulgating an upper caste ethos, and he does not suggest when he's in India that caste should be destroyed. He thinks it should be modified and that people should come and create their own castes and enter into these traditions. So he has a view of a dynamic hierarchical society that retains castes and many subcastes and diversity, but is not strict and rigid. It is extremely interesting, and I hope you'll read the book so that you can see how his views on caste changed and how they relate to the important question of untouchability, which he sometimes faces and other times just backs away from. Yes, he didn't understand it, but he was working with it. And the feminization of religion is a Western idea that historians in the West have talked about when they talk about the 19th century. And they say, well, let's look at all these women who are involved in missionizing, school teaching in the colonies and at home, and trying to use spirituality and Christianization as part of the way that they increase their moral and social status. But what's so interesting is that Vivekananda's mission inverts that. There are many women in his life, but instead of their becoming missionaries, especially the women in America and Britain, they become anti-imperialists and defenders of Indian autonomy against the West. This is totally surprising, especially if you look at their backgrounds. They came from very traditional Christian backgrounds. Some of them were even daughters of ministers. It's surprising that they didn't become missionaries and instead come to Vedanta. Instead, he also connects them with Sharada Devi, and they regard her as a saint. They worship her. No one would have expected these kinds of connections and the connections that the women between West and East made. Also, they were not women who were similar in values. They were different. And so it was both an extraordinary achievement, but profoundly paradoxical. No, on the contrary, I think that reducing Vivekananda to the first New Age guru is actually terribly reductive and almost sneering. There is no doubt in my mind that he is a door opener to many alternative forms of spiritual searching in the West. Though his vision of what he was bringing was very different. He was bringing a different idea of India. He was bringing an insistence on global tolerance. He was presenting a form of universalism that was not about Christian exclusivity. And he was defying, in his speech, the vision of a Western hegemony. At the same time, he also was saying that he believed in science, he believed in the language of matter, but he did not think it would supersede spirituality. This was a critique of Western rationality in its most violent form. there were two really big challenges. The biggest challenge was how to write a book that was both for an Indian audience and for a Western audience. In India, it was a joy because people all know Vivekananda, and many families have him in their psyche from family tradition. But strangely, many Indians don't really know Vivekananda because they don't read him, and because it's hard to follow such a tempestuous life and know it. So that was very difficult. For Westerners, there was a series of Hindu ideas, Vedantic ideas, that were so difficult, and also to convince them that they had to know about world thinkers that concern India other than Gandhi and Guru and Nehru. That there was more to India than these two, and that in fact, this is the man that perhaps had the greatest impact on Western culture. And that was what I was trying to do. At the same time, the hardest thing was how to describe concepts like non-dualism. Why it was that he thought Christianity had faults in certain ways, but he was nonetheless considered Christ a manifestation of the divine. These were all things that I had to try and explain to Westerners, and they were very, very difficult. And the third thing, which I haven't spoken about, but I'd like to speak about, is the question of writing a book about a great man that wasn't a great man biography. And so this book is mostly about women. It's about his relationships with women, his unorthodox discipleship under a very, very creative but highly original guru named Ramakrishna, and also how it was that his legacy was then shaped by other unorthodox people like Margaret Noble, Sister Nivedita, who people again know of, but have again a very, very two-dimensional view of. And she too is rocked by the paradoxes of East and West. And I tried very much to write about her so we could see not only how Vivekananda related to the West, but how Nivedita related to India. I think the most important thing he did, in my view, was that he sought to integrate the notion of the sannyasin and the detachment of the sannyasin with activism and sometimes militancy. And I think that describes why there's a militant edge in his teachings that remains throughout. And I think that that is something that is both beautiful but potentially often misunderstood. And I also think that he sought very much to use the techniques of his guru Ramakrishna to talk in the language of the people that he was addressing. So whether that be individuals or different audiences. And so that was also remarkable. He also talks in the West about making people less hard and materialistic. And when he was in India, he was talking to people who he thought were timid and subservient and who needed to be more assertive and more self-reliant. And so he was often trying to pull people to the middle, away from the things that kept them from realizing themselves, both as human beings but also as spiritual beings. Of course, I'm an author. I want everyone to read it, and that's not surprising. But I think that for Indians, what's important is to learn to get a more multifaceted view of Vivekananda, and also to see him in his human form, not as someone who has to be venerated, both the good and the bad, but also to integrate these many aspects of himself, as many Indians have to integrate all the thinkers, great thinkers of the 19th and 20th century, so that they can integrate different visions of India. In the West, I think we need to remember that yoga and meditation and everything that we think about Eastern spirituality actually has a basis in anti-colonialism. And he came with an anti-colonial message. And this is the things that people don't even know about. And they certainly don't know that he was challenging what he saw as muscular Christianity with a vision of flexibility, both moral, spiritual, and intellectual. I definitely do. I think that they've taken away the paradox. I think they've taken away the complexity. I think they've taken away a vision of him that I think they've reduced him to a nationalist icon, and that he will become very disappointing, because anything that's two-dimensional can't be interesting or fulfilling. And he's also made it difficult for people to think differently about Vivekananda. And I think that we don't even know that Vivekananda inspired people on the left just over a generation ago in Bengal, because that has been erased. We don't know that he dies at 39, and we have no idea what his political, let alone spiritual course would be. He is not like Gandhi, who goes on into his 80s and dies in 1948. This is a different world. This is a man who's in preparation, who's provocative, and I think he still has insights for the world, but in ways that are unexpected. Great. You can keep that in and throw out the others.
No.
Okay.
In the shadow of the cypress tree, I stumbled in its tangled roots, surrounded by the tree's forgotten leaves. My knees were bloodied, hands